we will probably have another bunch of people joining us, but we've got a lot to pack in today, so we'll get going. So first of all, welcome to CHP Australia's series of webinars. We've had a handful this year so far, and we're really looking forward to this one. So I'll introduce our guest speaker in a moment. A little bit of housekeeping. First of all, we'll do some Q&As at the end of the session. If we find there's a lot of questions and we're running over time, we will be recording the session. So if you do have to cut out right at the finish time of 4:30, we understand, but you'll be getting a full recording of the session, including the question and answer session. And the slides that Peter will be showing today will also be shared with you. So that's that. First of all, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Exporting to Asia is obviously had all sorts of ups and downs over the decades. But if you recall back to 2017, the heady days of particularly complementary medicines, but other medicines as well, shipping into Asia, particularly into China, the whole Daigou phenomena, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously piqued a lot of interest. A lot of companies got involved and were impacted. And so we thought, you know, that those times have changed, regulations have changed, competition has changed. And we thought it'd be good to get in an expert who we have today to really talk about what the scenario is like today and frankly, post the COVID world. So I'd like to introduce Peter Osborne. Peter's got a huge amount of experience and credentials in the whole export area. He has, I'll call it the diplomatic side of things, worked for many years in Austrade, and I think about 6 or 7 postings all over the place. He was basically the person who led the charge for Blackmore's expansion into Asia, into several countries, and currently sits on boards and advises many groups about exports. So without further ado, I'll thank Peter ahead of time in case we run right to the wire and hand it over to you. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Brenda, and good afternoon, everyone who's dialed in, and thanks for your time to come on the session today. And thanks to Brenda and David and the team at Consumer Health Products Australia for hosting this webinar. And I feel like a little bit of an imposter syndrome on this, because I know some of the people who've dialed in to watch the webinar today, participate, have got very deep experience in Asia, like mine. So for all of those on the calls, I hope I don't bore you with the presentation today. But look, I just wanted to sort of get started here and tell you what's on our menu for today. I'll give a bit of an update on the region after COVID. I'll talk about developing sort of business in offshore markets, a roadmap and checklist that I've used supporting a lot of companies, and including obviously for all the work we did at Blackmore's expanding across the region, including the sort of route to market models that might work. And then a few tips and insights, usually with using a lot of imagery of doing business in the region and some of the lessons I've learned over a couple of decades of supporting companies and doing business in the region. So let's get into it. And as Brenda said, well, I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session. So look, I just wanted to sort of talk a bit about Asia after COVID, and I guess we're all well aware of quite a lot of the changes and developments that have occurred. But I think, as we all know, some things did get better during COVID, and this was, I think you might have seen this picture of basically pollution levels in the region in 2009 compared with 2020. And I think that's something for us to sort of think about more broadly in the longer term for all of us around just what happens when people stop doing some of the things we were doing, we had to do during the lockdowns across the region. And I think that this slide is pretty graphic at demonstrating that. But I think if we look at Asia, and there's no doubt that Asia's growth will continue unabated, and its contribution to sort of the global economy and the global GDP will increase. And I've put some statistics up there, which I think are hopefully quite enlightening around consumer expenditure in the region, the population, and of course, as many of us know who've been doing business in the region quite some time, and particularly cross-border e-commerce, the very significant percentage of e-commerce sales that play in the region. But as you can see from the data from the IMF, Asia's contribution in the region will continue for the foreseeable future. And look, there's a few slides here with quite a lot of data on them, and you can flick through them yourselves at a later stage. But I think GDP growth, as you know, in Asia is strong compared with many other markets in the world, and will continue to be that way if we look at, again, the IMF's predictions for 2023, 2024. But one comment I'd like to make is that I think sometimes as businesses, and particularly as boards and others, we get a bit too obsessed with GDP numbers. And I think what really matters most is consumer spending and consumer spending intent. And also to think about how much does GDP growth really impact your business. So actually, if the market's growing at 2%, 3%, 6% or 8%, does it really impact your business at the amount of product you're selling level? So don't get too fixated with the GDP numbers. Is often what I think, and what I used to try to say to the Blackmores board all the time in the past. But consumer spending is the thing that's obviously going to continue to drive economies across the region. And a few of these charts here are pretty complicated and will test your eyesight and test if you've been taking your lutein products before this sort of session. But as you can see, across the region, we've got reasonably good levels of consumer spending and increases between 2022 and 2023. But I'll get into some of the other issues as I go through this information. But overall, consumption and spending has picked up and will continue to pick up in most markets across the region in the foreseeable future. And as you can see from this chart here, you're seeing a rebound in certain markets, particularly in early 2023, of consumer spending in a range of key areas, and that growth is coming back. But it is patchy across the region, and even within certain markets, it's also quite patchy. Obviously, in the bigger markets, it's patchy between different major centres, urban centres. And look, I think one of the big things that obviously is a big focus for everyone and for the region and globally is China. And I guess this McKinsey put out a report only just literally about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which is very much worth a read. And you can see the source on the bottom there if you want to just get it from the McKinsey site. But they're talking about being cautiously optimistic on China and the growth in sort of key consumer product categories, and also the growth in air travel. And as many of us will know, travel and both domestic travel and international travel in China is a really good indicator of how consumers are thinking and and how bullish they are on the economy and on the market overall, and how they're starting to spend. So you can see why McKinsey is saying they're cautiously optimistic about the Chinese economy. However, as many of you might have seen just in the last week or so, China is now officially in deflation, and for those who follow China, we've got significant issues around the property market, and so much of Chinese savings and consumption is driven by, I guess, property wealth. And so, as you can see from the chart on the right, you've seen a significant increase in savings in savings from Chinese consumers. And I think what that really shows, obviously, is they're saving their money, they're not spending it. And so while consumption is increasing, and we can see from some of those other charts, what I think is really interesting development in China in particular, and it's the same theme across the region, which is the same in probably Australia, I guess, as well, is that consumers are really focused on that sort of quality value sort of matrix, if we put it that way. And I think increasingly in China, that's become even more heightened. And my own view is with the sort of moving into official deflation and these property market issues, I think Chinese consumers will become even more focused on the quality of what they're buying and the value of what they're purchasing. And now here's a really great chart to really test your eyesight. But I think this is a really interesting chart, which comes from the Brookings Institute, which shows, and some of you may have seen it before, shows the growth of a whole range of different markets and countries in the world from now until 2030. And I've used the term here, where would you place your bets? And I think, as you can see here, there's a range of interesting implications here around markets within the region. Obviously, Indonesia is a market of significant potential for Australian companies continuing to grow. Markets like markets like Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Asia, if we put it that way, are markets that generally aren't on the radar of many Australian companies. But in my view, they are worth a look, and they're recovering quite quickly, recovering very quickly after COVID. Obviously, where you've got the developed markets in the region, particularly Japan, Korea, and others, there's not expected to be significant growth in those markets. But I just think it's an interesting chart when you're thinking about your strategy going forward around where you might place your bets, or markets that are worth a bit of a look at that you might not have thought of before. Right, so just sort of moving on to the sort of healthcare space, because that's the space that many of us are operating in, and just keep it as you look at this picture here. There's the little blue you can see on the left hand side of that display. There's a company called Wonderlab, which is advertising that little blue bottle, and I'll get onto Wonderlab towards the end of this session, this section of the presentation. So I think again on the call we're all well aware that Asia Pacific remains a really major region in the vitamins and dietary supplements, complementary healthcare, health and wellbeing space, and will continue to grow and continue to be a major player, this region in the global market for the foreseeable future, and it's dominating the growth across globally around the space. And I guess vitamins and dietary supplements post COVID are really what's been driving the market and continue to grow. Obviously, there's a major market around sports nutrition and weight management. Weight management is also big in the region, but overall, vitamins and dietary supplements, VDS, is the biggest category in the region, and also the biggest category globally. And as we can see from this chart, Asia Pacific is a major part of the total global market. This is quite an interesting survey. I mean, some of us might normally get our information from Herbalife, but this is a really interesting survey. It was very recent. It was actually only released about 3 or 4 weeks ago, or maybe 4 weeks ago. And I think there's some interesting points in here around the sort of changes, and most of this reflects what's happened post-COVID. There's been definitely a significant increase in people's focus on their own health and well-being, and their willingness to spend in the category. And as you can see down the bottom there, whether that's making healthier food choices, buying vitamins, having checkups, seeking expert advice, and also interestingly is the piece around mental health consultation down the bottom there. But I also think what's interesting and a theme for brands and companies like your own is around the importance of support group and the importance of information. And my view in the region is consumers in the region are becoming increasingly sophisticated when they look at their own health and well-being. And during COVID, they spent a lot of time researching and spending time looking at these issues and what they could do for preventative health care or for their own health and well-being for themselves and their families. And I think for brands, we need to consider how we can support those information needs for consumers, and really put a lot of effort into that, to making sure that consumers understand what they're taking and that we're a source of that information provision for them. Because Asian consumers, and particularly Chinese consumers, are very, very focused on information and collecting information for their purchase decision. I mean, obviously, vitamins and dietary supplements remain a major. People have a very positive view of that, and I think, like all markets post-COVID, that's I think really grown on people's radar to consider vitamins and dietary supplements to support their nutritional needs or to support their own health and well-being. So that remains, I think, very positive for activity in the region. And this is some stats from Euromonitor, and for those of you who like digging into statistics, Euromonitor probably has the best data across the region where you can sort of compare markets, even though at times it probably could be a little bit better. But overall, I guess what we're seeing on this chart here is the consumer health market in Asia is very large. It's a $90 billion US dollar market. Vitamin dietary supplement market is around $50 billion. So it's a significant market for Australian companies to play in. And as we well know, Australia has quite a dominant position across the region in the way consumers perceive brands out of Australia and New Zealand, but particularly obviously because of the very strong regulatory environment the TGA has enforced in Australia, and how that supports Australian brands to export. And as you can see across the chart here, you've got the size of the markets and the growth, and you've got really strong growth looking out to 2027 in all of these markets in the region. So definitely Asia should be on your radar if it's not already, is what I would say. And just one of the really big impacts, I think, of COVID was obviously the growth of domestic brands across Asia, and there's a few of the ones that have grown really rapidly here and doing new sort of innovative things. One is Wonderlab, which is a Chinese brand with probiotics, and it's now one of the biggest probiotic brands in China. It's a company out of Shenzhen. Basically didn't exist more than about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And then the product down the bottom is the probiotic Ultrabite out of Korean company, as is the company called Haratine, which has selling liposomal vitamin C out of Korea. So you've had a really strong growth in domestic brands as a result of COVID, because there were restrictions on importing, global supply chain shut down. And so a lot of these brands grew, and also, I guess, they're very close to the consumer. And what you also will notice from these pictures is a real focus and a change in format. So as you can see, we've got Wonderlab with these little bottles, which they have the probiotic in there. The strips, the powder strips down the bottom on the left from Ultrabite, and then liposomal vitamin C as a gummy inside each individual gummy individually packed from Haratine out of Korea. So I think that when you're thinking about your brand and think about your business going forward, you really want to have a look at these domestic brands, see what they're doing, because a lot of them particularly drive format. But the other thing that you'll notice from this slide, I hope you'll notice, is these brands, and at least the products here, they're not particularly environmentally sustainable. Because if you think about Wonderlab, that's a lot of plastic they're throwing away, as is a lot of plastic that's being thrown away by these other brands when it comes to the packaging format. So in my view, there's a bit of a difference between talk around sustainability and environmental focus and stuff like that across the region relative to what domestic consumer brands are actually doing. But the watch out there is really have a look at what these domestic brands are doing, and see what you can learn from them, but also see how that might impact your own brand. And another really interesting development which has been driven very, very heavily by COVID is what's it called? Shoppertainment. And this is really being driven by TikTok in particular in the region, or Douyin as it's called in China. As you can see there, potentially reaching 1 trillion in GMV by 2025. And if you look at that chart on the right, TikTok's GMV in billions of dollars between 2021 to 2023, and the number of markets they've expanded to is really very, very significant. And if you see that CAGR growth, crazy. But and you can see the report on the bottom, which is worth having a read of. Again, you can get it off the TikTok site or off BCG's site. And I think, but what this says is you really need, again, for your brand, you need to really think about how you can access the whole concept of shoptainment, which is really entertainment, selling products using entertaining ways of doing it. And for any companies that don't have a TikTok or Douyin strategy, I think that's something you really need to have a look at. Right, but there's a great Malaysian saying that this is don't think there aren't any crocodiles under the water just because the water's still. And what that's saying really is that there are still quite a lot of issues across the region post-COVID. As I mentioned before, savings are up, and I think that's around a bit of fear, sort of hesitancy, and rethinking what the future might look like. I think many of you will be aware of this China youth unemployment rate, which is 21.3%. And interestingly, just this morning, the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, as of today, stopped publishing youth unemployment rates, which probably means it's even higher than that, which is always a good indicator when they stop publishing statistics. Across developing Asia, obviously COVID removed a massive amount of child and youth education because people couldn't get to school. They didn't have access to online education. So that's a big impact for the future. A rise in nationalism across many of these markets. And unfortunately, corruption also grew a fair bit during COVID and took hold where maybe it was being controlled a bit better before. For those of us working across ASEAN, I mean, we've all held out for ASEAN harmonisation, but it continues to sort of creep forward. and the finishing line keeps moving. So I think that's one. It's one to always watch, but if you're sort of holding out hope for significant harmonisation across ASEAN when it comes to regs, etc., I think that's still a slow process. And then obviously in the region, we've got a couple of the major flashpoints of the globe with the South China Sea, Taiwan and China, and other issues across the region. So still plenty of crocodiles in the water. And this slide sort of indicates, it was done by a very interesting survey around sort of youth perceptions of issues across the region. And as you can see, they're the sorts of things that we'd expect to see. But really an interesting focus there around sort of climate change, obviously unemployment unemployment growth affecting a lot of these markets in the region, and therefore you've got some socio-economic changes happening. And then, that's the truth. We have got a range of potential military flashpoints across Asia, which are worrying to people within the region. So I'll just a little break. That's the sort of COVID update. Post-COVID, and now just talk a little bit about the sort of roadmap to access markets. And again, for many of you on the call, I know this is fairly standard stuff for you, but it is good just to sort of revisit it, I think. And I guess I sort of use what's like a roadmap of market entry, and there's a couple of phases to that, and there's a couple of core pieces to the roadmap. Firstly, it's just understanding the market itself. I mean, get as much information as you can on the market. Who are your competitors? This is all sort of pretty standard stuff, but always surprises me how some companies don't spend the time doing enough research first. And I think obviously regulatory review is the thing you really need to look at straight away, is put a regulatory lens over the markets that you want to enter, and then can you actually enter that market? And even if you can enter, and then can you actually do business in that market with your products, or do you need to change formulations? And then obviously, how long does it take to actually get your products registered for sale? Because if it takes too long, is it actually worth doing? Obviously goes without saying, trademark and intellectual property protection is really critical in the region, and you really want to make sure you're well covered from a trademark registration perspective in any markets you're looking at, and also have you got your IP covered, and make your IP a part of your market entry strategy. Obviously, you've got a lot of supporters in the region and stakeholders, and how do you assess and identify those key stakeholders? And you've got organisations like CHPA, you've got Austrade, you've got the state governments, you've got banks, you've got other bilateral chambers of commerce who can help you with that, to look at the market and work out who the stakeholders are that you can engage with and who can support you. And then finally, sort of in-market resources. And I'm a huge believer in needing to have feet on the ground, or have people in market who can support you, who know the market, the idiosyncrasies of the market. And I credit the success of Blackmores in Asia. I mean, Blackmores grew from being about a $20 million business to over 300 million in gross sales business in Asia, went from 100 to 1,000 staff. And the reason for its success, in my view, is because we had no expats. And even I wasn't an expat when I worked there. It was all local staff. And I think having on-ground resources is really critical to market entry, whether that's a consulting resource, whether that's your own staff, but you need to have people in the market to help you. So that's the sort of first phase. And then the second phase, I guess, is just really moving through those same key areas, obviously with more detail around, looking at the regulatory review, engaging sort of advisors who can help you around that, to look at your product range, make sure you've got your trademarks filed. Do you need any resources on the ground there that you can employ? And then look at your route to market development. What sort of models are you going to use? And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Identify those sorts of partners, and then look at how you build your brand and build your brand assets in the market. Obviously, having materials in local language. Do you need a local website? And then obviously, and participation in trade shows, etc. And then finally, it's just keeping that going. The third phase, which is really about finalising your product registrations, having your trademarks registered, starting to build your own capabilities on the ground, whether that's building your own team or having a distributed partnership and embedding staff within that team. That was a model that Blackmores often used in new market entries. Even if we had a full agency distributor partnership in place, we would embed a couple of Blackmores staff in the distributor team, so we could learn and then gradually over time we'd build our own capabilities in that market. We'll look at the channel partners you're going to work with, and also look at, do you actually, is it worth, depending on the scale of the market, should you set up a corporate entity in the market, and again have a subsidiary company there, for example. So that's the sort of roadmap I think is worth considering when you're looking at new markets. And in the route to market models, I mean, I've obviously copied these. I think I forgot to put the source on it, but from a number of sources. And I think, again, most of us on the call are familiar with these types of routes to market. You start off, whether you start off just exporting to a distributor partner, or you're licensing, or you're franchising there, having a strategic partnership in the market, maybe potentially having a joint venture or having a wholly owned subsidiary. And I think all of these routes to market really depend on the market itself, and also your own company capability to manage those relationships, manage those partnerships. And obviously what's not really covered here, as mentioned too much to you, is direct consumer model using e-commerce platforms, whether that's you're running your own e-commerce site out of Australia, or whether you're working on with the platforms like Alibaba or Lazada or Shopee or whoever in market. But I think what's really critical when you think about route to market, your route to market model, is your own capability to manage that model. And I think this is from my observation from assisting a lot of companies in the last couple of years, giving advice to particularly Australian and US companies entering Asia and entering China, is you really need to see how much resources you can dedicate from the group and from the company overall to the market entry. And then your route to market model really is also supported or hindered by that. And how you can what's your capability to manage in-market distributors or agents, or if you're setting up a subsidiary company, to manage your own a remote team, and how much experience the people in your company have to do that. And so I think these things are really worth thinking through in a lot of detail as you look at entering a new market. And also I think thinking out, I always think a way to look at it is, what's the best phased approach to do this? Is you start off with potentially you start off just with you're exporting to an agent in the market or a distribution partner, you support them, and you look at, as I say, maybe you embed a staff in a distributor after the first 6 months or 12 months, you start to develop capability in the market, then over time, potentially you move to having your own wholly owned subsidiary or a team on the ground in the market. But it really depends on the market, the growth, your product, and also, as I say, your capability across your own team to manage that type of model. And here's another way of, looking at it from Bain around an indirect or a direct model or a mixed model, depending on what you want to achieve in that market. Right, and so I'll just I'm ploughing along here. I know there's a lot of content, but bear with me. Mostly it's pictures now. But just for the next 10 or 15 minutes, just sort of share a bit of some views on how to sort of hit your target in Asia, and the things you should think about and things you should or shouldn't do. And I think there's a great one of my favourite Chinese proverbs, and I'm a big one for Chinese proverbs. If you don't go to the tiger's cave, how can you catch the tiger's son? I'm not sure why you'd really want to catch a tiger's son, but anyway, what it's really saying, of course, is if you don't go to the region, you're not going to be able to access the opportunities there unless you really look at playing in Asia. And as I've said before, in the categories that we're playing in, for all of us on this call, Asia Pacific and Asia is really the growth driver of the globe in our space for the next decade. And these things are another couple of proverbs which I think are really worth thinking about. The fierce tiger is inferior to the local worm, and when the tiger comes down from the mountain to the plain, it gets bullied by the dogs. And the reason for using these proverbs is, even if we're a major player in our own home market, we're a major player in another market, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be a major player or we're going to be able to do the same things when we enter a new market. So I think always think about that. And some of this might sound like motherhood statements, but it never ceases to amaze me how many companies go to enter a new market and think because they're going great in their home market, they're going to just blow it away when they get to a new market. And like this saying says, often when they go to a new market, they get very much bullied by the local dogs. It's not a level playing field, and that's the other thing to think about. I mean, these markets in Asia, there's vastly different vast differences across all these markets in the region, whether it be regulation, culture, business culture, and the way that things are done. So it's not a level playing field, and it's not going to be like the home market that you're operating in. There's lots of things you can do in these markets, and as the slide shows, there's lots of things you also can't do. And this sign is actually from the local park near where I live. So I won't be taking my dog, my fireworks, or my firearm down to the local park too often, and I won't be playing a trumpet. So lots of things you can't do, and particularly if you're going to the beach. So I'm a surfer, but so unfortunately, lots of things you can't do in the region. So you need to know what you can do and what you can't do. And also, you really, as I mentioned before, it's really important to do your research. So it's hard to know where to go if you can't see where you're going. And again, I think it's really critical to spend the time doing the research. And a good example of this, I think, is when Blackmores entered China, and we entered China in 2012, and we were highly successful in China, obviously. But we spent 2 years researching that market, and myself and Raymond Chan, my deputy manager at the time, we made probably 15, 20 trips to China in the 2 years before that, meeting lots of people, talking to everyone, looking at the market. So put a massive amount of effort into that market before we actually entered the market. So do your research, and this is a great expression from Sun Tzu. You know, he who knows the enemy, will never in 100 battles be at risk. He who does not know the enemy knows himself will sometimes win and sometimes lose. He who knows neither the enemy nor himself will be at risk in every battle. So you really need, gets back to my comment before about, you need to also know your own company, your own capabilities, and not overestimate them when you're thinking about going offshore and going into new markets. And in fact, if any of you that have on this call don't know this, the CIA is an awesome source of information. And you may not realize this, but they have something called the World Factbook. So you can actually go to cia.gov, and there is a thing called the World Factbook, which has some of the best information on literally any market in the world or any country in the world you can think about. It has everything about the country, politics, economics, what's the issues, risks, etc. So I hope you learn. If you take nothing else away from this presentation today, go and check out the CIA website and the CIA World Factbook. It's a really awesome way of looking at markets. And it's also usually very, very current. They keep it up to date very regularly. Don't try to do your own wiring, okay? Get good advice. It's really important that you get good local advice in these markets, and advice from people who are in the market and who spend a lot of time in the market. It's, these markets have changed very rapidly. I mean, they're some of the fastest growing markets in the world. And so what was relevant 6 months ago or 3 months ago may not be relevant today. So don't try to do your own wiring. Get in there and get good advice. Take time to learn to play the game, and don't rush into things. Make sure you really understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. Is this the best market to enter, and then can you support it? Otherwise, you're going to get caught. You really need to know how to navigate the traffic in all of these different markets, and to avoid the accidents. So you don't want to be like this guy with a black Audi up the tree somewhere in China when you go to these countries. And you need to know how to catch the right taxi. This is a great photo from when the French had a dispute with the Chinese about 10 or 15 years ago, and all the taxi drivers refused to take Frenchmen in their cars, so refused to carry Frenchmen and dogs. So you need to understand what's going on in the market all the time. As I said, being flexible and adaptable is really critical in these markets in the region, and I think as a business you need to be flexible and adaptable, and the staff who work on these markets need to also have those traits in the way they operate. Be creative in the way you do your product, and you're going to, in many of these countries and markets, you're going to need to have to adapt your products to the market, whether it's reformulation, whether it's product format, whatever. And you can see a few examples of that as I showed in the slide before with the Wonderlab photo and stuff like that. And check and modify your product packaging, because what might work in one market may not work in another market. So probably selling Thundercrap fireworks in Australia may not work. It seems to be perfectly fine in Guangxi in China. And be prepared for the unexpected, and how to sort of navigate through what can sometimes be fairly challenging circumstances in some of these different markets. Governments are really important in Asia. Governments are important everywhere, but governments are really important in Asia, and particularly obviously in places like China and Vietnam, where you've got centrally planned economies. But in all markets, you really need to understand government regulations, build your relationships with government, but also sort of be wary of strangers who say they've got great guanxi. And guanxi is a Chinese term for relationships and networks. And many times you'll meet distributors and partners in Asia who'll say they've got great guanxi, they can get you to meet the president, they can get you to meet someone. It's always worth taking that with a pinch of salt, and also understanding whether those relationships or networks are actually any use to you and the business you're trying to develop. Don't sort of scoff at local customs. I mean, it's really important to understand the customs of and the beliefs of the markets you go into. I'm a huge believer in feng shui, for example, and even in Blackmores, we never did anything in our markets in Asia without consulting a feng shui expert, whether it was how we moved set up our office, whatever we did. So I think it's really important to understand local culture and local customs and what the impact that does or doesn't have on what you're trying to do in the market. And you know, the operating environment is often not particularly black and white. And some of these markets, you know, Asian people often prefer grey, and I don't mean grey in the sense of illegal activity. I mean grey in that they're very comfortable in the area that's not black and it's not white. So, and in some markets and in some categories that you work in, there isn't any rules or regulations, and then it's a matter of working out, well, actually, what can I do or what can't I do? And again, that's where you really need on the ground support. Culture is really important, as I said before, to understand, but also remember when you're doing business in Asia that culture is also a negotiating tactic. And many of the people you deal with will use culture and that to negotiate with you. And in my view, you always need to, firstly, never forget your own cultural identity. You're Australian or wherever you're from in your home market. The bottom line in the end is still a transaction, and never lose sight of what you're there for. And what you're there for is to do business normally. So don't forget that sometimes culture is going to be used as a negotiating tactic when people are dealing with you. And not everyone's friendly. That's the truth. Some people basically do want to rip you off, and they will rip you off. So always, you know, make sure you check and double check and confirm with the people that you're dealing with. And beware of backyard operators. And this actually is a real photo where a guy built a helicopter in his backyard in China. So beware of backyard operators. Stick with people that have good reputation. Check them out. Make sure they're sound before you do anything. Language, and I just want to sort of talk just very briefly about the sort of nuance of language in the region. And again, many of you on the call have done lots of business and spent a lot of time in Asia, but I use the term happy smiling faces. And as you know, Asian people, just negative replies are impolite, and many people in Asia won't give a negative reply. So no could be maybe, it could be, they might say, I'll think about it, or we'll see. When people say we'll give it our best efforts, often means there's really no hope at all. And when they smile at you and say, no problem, Mr. Osborne, usually means there's lots of problems and they just don't know what to do about it. So I think the important thing is to read the body language in these conversations you have side conversations, take the issue offline, talk to someone else, or sometimes go go through the hierarchy to work out what's really going on. And just a comment here about, you know, corruption is, there is a lot of corruption across the region, and you know, I think the main thing here is that you just don't do it. Just never go down that path, because it's a really long slippery slope. Just don't do it. I mean, you don't do it in Australia, so don't start doing it in Asia. It only leads to one destination, and that's not a good place you want to be. Corruption and engaging in corruption is illegal in these markets in Asia. It's also illegal, obviously, under the Foreign Corporations Act with this in Australia as well. Good business practice works just as well in Asia as it does in Australia, and invest in good long-term relationships. Intellectual property protection, as I've said, sometimes this perception versus reality, as I put here. This photo here, the number plates are the same, but they're actually from two different provinces in China. But you do need to always assume that someone's going to steal your IP. So you need to assess those risks up front and make intellectual property protection and trademark registrations, etc., an integral part of your strategy in the region. And this is a good piece that's put together by McKinsey, and I won't dwell on it, but you can sort of see the must-haves and the nice-to-haves around the sorts of things you need to do to make sure that you're going to be able to protect your intellectual property when you go to do business in these markets. And I think the big thing here is make sure you put that in your market assessment strategy, is assessing the IP risk that you may or may not have in a particular market. And I think just a couple of comments about communicating in the region. I mean, email is used extensively. Most people in Asia prefer to communicate through social media. Obviously, if you're communicating with anyone in China, you've got to have WeChat, because people basically don't use anything else. Well, they can't use anything else but WeChat because everything else is blocked. But people in China particularly will pretty much only communicate with WeChat. So you need to use WeChat. As you can see, this is off my phone. But in these different markets, people in Korea tend to use Kakao Talk, which is called Kakao Talk. People in Taiwan and Thailand and other markets tend to use Line. WhatsApp's used fairly extensively across the region. Obviously, Instagram and others are blocked in China. But get used to using social media and communicating using social media in China, because it's the fastest way to communicate. And lots of people in the region actually just don't even use email anymore. They only communicate through social media. And sort of finally, I'd say is just sort of get out there. You know, you really want to, if you're going to do business in these markets, you need to spend time in the markets. You need to get out there, meet the people, meet the teams. There's nothing like that sort of first-hand experience of actually being in these markets and talking to people. And just finally, I know I've just got a couple more minutes left before we go to Q&A, but here's my sort of 10 tips for doing business in the region. Halve your expectations and double your time and budget. And I think that's a really one to really put, which is why it's number one. Never sort of assume anything. Research, as I said, check, monitor how things are going. As I said, stay away from any sort of corrupt behaviour. Always do the right thing right, and just never go down that path. If it seems to be too good to be true, if a deal seems to be good to be true, a partner seems too good to do, it probably is too good to be true. So make sure you check it out. Expect the unexpected and be ready to adapt and adopt and adapt and shift your strategy and change it as the market moves or as consumers move. When you have partnerships, there's a great Chinese expression about lying in the same bed but having different dreams. And I think whatever partnership you've got to put a lot of time into those partnerships in the region. You've got to visit there, you've got to bring them down to headquarters, and also watch for changes in their ambition or their objectives as time goes on, because everyone's ambitions and objectives change when it comes to a business. So watch out that people aren't having different dreams to yours. I think the other really thing that I really want to stress is you need a total company approach to this. You can't just have a team that's doing the Asian business that's sort of separate from the rest of the business. And you've got to be willing to move your total group business at the speed that Asia moves. And Asia moves much faster than Australia. That's just the simple truth. So you need to have a total group approach to that. I think talent's really critical. You need to have people in your business who understand these markets, who either operated in there, or if you don't have that, you need to have some sort of external advice to support you around that. You need to be persistent and tenacious and resilient and flexible, and you need to be really passionate about the business. And I think, again, just reflecting on Blackmore's success in the region, one of the reasons Blackmore's was so successful in Asia was because Marcus Blackmore and Christine Holgate, Chairman and CEO at the time I was at Blackmore's, were deeply passionate about Asia. They loved Asia. They wanted to do business there. They wanted to support consumers there. They visited all the time. I mean, they visited the time the board visited regularly. So you really need to be passionate about the markets that you're going into, passionate about that business. And my final saying, because there's a lot of Aussies on the call, Asia's a market. It's not the magic pudding. So don't expect that going into Asia or going into China or going to this market is going to be the thing that solves your company's problems, etc. Because it's not the magic pudding. It's a market. It's a market that's got significant potential, significant opportunities, but it takes a lot of hard work to succeed in these markets. And finally, I'll just say thank you. And that's a photo of me in Bhutan, where I spend a lot of time doing my philanthropic activity with a dog wearing Bhutanese outfit, and I love these boots. So I love my Bhutanese boots. So thanks everyone. I'm happy to take questions, and I think Linda, I think Brenda, I've just gone like 2 minutes over time.
Oh, that's great. You packed in a lot, Peter. So I guess the first thing I'd say is any one of your slides could be probably, you know, a day's worth of training, advice, et cetera, et cetera. So I see this as a great taster of all the different elements. So thank you. Super comprehensive. We've got some questions coming in. So we'll, then I've got a couple myself. So first one is, it was interesting that the 3 local product examples had so much plastic and packaging. Do you think this is because consumers are not prioritizing sustainability, or because there's a lack of regulations encouraging change? Are there lessons for Aussie companies looking to export products with green credentials, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one where, look, I think overall there is a strong growing interest in sustainability and environmental issues, etc. But I think there's a bit of a disconnect between what consumers say and then what consumers actually do. And I think even though I know that, for example, Wonderlab, there was a lot of pushback against Wonderlab after about the first 12 months with those little blue bottles, and they have changed to trying to have a sort of a refillable, a small refillable bottle and stuff like that. But overall, I think from the question, it's a combination of consumer preference, and actually, I think in a number of these markets, consumers aren't that focused on this. They're more focused on the product than actually whether it's in a, you know, they just want the product. And if it comes in a cute little blue bottle, well, that's okay. And also the regulations in quite a few of these countries here are really pretty slack and pretty lax, and there's not a lot of enforcement, of that. But overall, the overall theme is there, and I think it does vary. Obviously, you know, the theme in Singapore is much stronger than, say, for example, if you're selling product in Vietnam. I mean, it's just that's sustainability, environmental theme. But I think it's something really interesting to watch. And what I would say is, for Australian companies, I think it's quite fine to talk about those credentials. It's great to have those credentials, but generally they won't have probably the same impact that you expect they would have in, say, Australia or New Zealand or Singapore.
Okay. Thank you. Second question, you mentioned that culture can be used as a negotiating tactic. Are you able to expand on that? Examples, or what does it mean?
Oh, yeah, I think getting you completely smashed drinking Mau Tai in some bar in Beijing and trying to get you to sign a contract is one thing. But no, look, I do think when I say culture is used as a negotiating tactic, there's a lot of discussion in Asia, obviously, about face, and we all know that it's important. You don't want people to lose face when you're in a negotiation. But for example, you'll often get into a discussion or a negotiation where, as you're going through that process, people will start saying to you, "Oh, look, I really can't give you that price because I'm going to lose face in front of my boss." And look, that's just not how it works here. That's just not how it works here in Vietnam. We don't do it that way. You know, I really need to be able to present that up to the hierarchy, etc. I'm not saying that that's not real and those things, but I think whenever you start hearing that type of talk in a negotiation in particular, you really just want to step back and think, okay, is this real, or is this actually just being used as a negotiating technique so I can get a few more cents off, so they can get a few more cents off? And the way to check that really is to have people around you, or have people involved who know that nuance in the market and understand that. So I think you sort of almost just double check anything that's got that sort of cultural overlay across it.
Okay, and just on that, how would you say Aussies are viewed in that sense, dealing with other cultures in Asia? What would their perspective be? That we're too bold, we're too this, we're not enough that?
Yeah, look, I think Australians have a good reputation generally in the market. I think Australians are seen as very trustworthy, and I think they're seen as flexible and adaptable, much more so than particularly Americans and Europeans. But I think Australians are also often seen in some of these markets as a bit gullible and a bit too trusting, a bit too trusting. So, and sometimes that can be taken advantage of. But overall, our reputation in the region is a good one. And I think in the number of these markets too, Australian companies are often seen as a good sort of counter to sort of, whether it's product from another market or it's influence from another market. And a good example is, years ago I was involved in discussions in Beijing with on behalf of Blackmores and the other Aussie brands there as well, Swiss, and I think Justin might be on the call, who was involved in those discussions. It was to do with regulations in China, and we were in a room with a group in the Ministry of Commerce in Beijing. And at the end of the meeting, and there was American companies, Japanese, etc. the Americans were very loud and really pushing sort of about legal stuff in the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, everyone had left. And the guys from the Ministry of Commerce actually came up to us at the end and said, "Oh, would really like you Aussies to be much more involved in this, because we really just don't like dealing with the Americans." And it was a very blatant sort of comment around that. So look, I think overall, yeah, we're very well regarded, Brenda, but we are sometimes probably a bit too trusting.
Yeah. Next question. What's the best strategy to manage the Daigou channel or CBEC channels when there's the pricing advantage in Australia over Asian markets where the general trade products could be more expensive?
Well, I could spend about a week discussing that topic. Look, I think pricing, honestly, managing pricing between, if you're doing direct cross-border business through your own partners or your own store on Tmall or JD or whatever, and you also got Daigou trade, I think you need to sort of watch that pricing really closely and watch movements in particular product volumes, etc., that are moving, if you think they're moving through the Daigou trade. I mean, to be honest, after COVID, obviously the Daigou is nothing like they were before. And other than the big wholesale Daigou traders are still there. But I think you really need to, I guess, have a mechanism where you can monitor pricing, and particularly how you can monitor pricing on Taobao. So it's not only you can monitor what you're doing on, say, your Tmall, your own flagship store or whatever, and you can see what you're selling it in the Australian market as. But I think you need to have and there's plenty of companies that can do it, or if you've got Chinese-speaking staff, they can do it themselves, is to monitor what's the selling price on Taobao in particular, and then work out if you've sort of got where you think there might be sort of leakage in your sales strategy, to be able to make sure there's not too big a differential between the Daigou pricing and your direct pricing. But it's to be very open, it's very difficult to manage and very difficult to control.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Anne asks, is it worth hiring a translator for any country I'd potentially be dealing with?
My view is you need to, it's good to have someone who can help you in whatever market dealing in. I mean, obviously, if you're dealing in markets where you've got very strong English capability, whether it's Singapore or Hong Kong, but in any other market, I think you really want to have someone who can interpret for you, translate for you, and just also understand the sort of cultural nuances and idiosyncrasies of discussions as they're happening. So another piece of advice is, if ever you're in a negotiation or in a room where you're negotiating or discussing with people, always have your own interpreter, because most companies in these markets will say, "Oh, it's fine, we'll provide the interpreter to you." And so, but if the interpreter's on their side of the table, all you're getting is a filtered version that they want to give you. And when you're speaking back, you don't know what's actually being translated back. So whenever you're in, and particularly in a critical discussion, you always want to have your own interpreter who's on your team and who's on your side.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Another one. Is it best to negotiate with a master distributor in Southeast Asia to control pricing until the ASEAN harmonization kicks in, or are there advantages to using multiple distributors across the region?
I mean, my own view is it's really quite difficult unless you're dealing with one of the really big companies, like, for example, a DKSH or a Zulik, that's a major distributor across the whole region. But even those major distributors that have got a sort of a pan-regional approach, it's really their country teams that are the ones that actually do the business. And so often what happens if you're dealing with a master distributor or dealing with someone who's covering the whole region, in the end, you end up probably paying 2 to 5% margin for someone sitting in a regional headquarters when the real work's being done at a country level anyway. So my own view is you're far better off having in-market distribution partnerships rather than a regional arrangement. Even if you say, so for example, before Blackmores, we use Zulik and we use DKSH in some markets as a 3PL, but those 3PL relationships were all negotiated at a country level. We would have a regional, we knew the regional heads or whatever, but we never had a regional partnership. We would always deal at a local market level, because generally, as I say, you're usually losing a bit of margin. You're losing a bit of margin there. And also you've got another filter in some ways between yourself and what's actually happening on the ground in the market.
Okay, thanks. A couple more here. I think we got a couple minutes. You touched on IP a bit, in terms of, the pyramid and getting your foundations correct. Is there really any protection in reality when you're looking at some of these Asian markets? And any comment on counterfeits as well, that whole?
Look, I think the thing with I think you've got to have you should have all your trademarks registered, because if you don't have a trademark registered, someone is potentially going to get it, squat on it, and try to sell it back to you. So I think you need to have your really sort of basic fundamentals of intellectual property protection covered, because I think it's a bit like if you've got a burglar going to a house and there's two houses, one's got a lock on the door and one's got the door open. They're going to go into the one with the door open. So yeah, you want to have those basic, all those sort of pillars of IP covered first. But then the reality is, in a lot of these markets, the first thing I'd say is no one's usually going to bother stealing your IP or taking until you get to a certain scale. And having seen that from Blackmore's experience, when we're a big, Blackmore's is a very big brand across the region. We didn't have really many IP problems until we got above a certain scale in certain markets. And once we got above a certain scale and the product was relatively easy to copy or to do something with, then we sometimes had a challenge. But I think you need to stand back and think, well, actually, is anyone going to bother copying your product, stealing your IP, until your volume gets to a certain level? But as I say, the thing to really be really careful of is trademark registration, and also URL and website registrations, because people will register those. If they see your brand moving in a certain market, they will try to register that trademark or register a URL and then just squat on it. And then if you want to go to that market or go to move, they'll squat on it. You'll have to buy it back from them. So that's the sort of, and then if you do end up in a major intellectual property dispute, then you need to sort of obviously have the right legal advice, deal with local government agencies that deal with that. And if you're on the platforms in China, obviously the platforms themselves have their own intellectual property protection units that are really actually very helpful when you do have an IP dispute.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question. Could you please name the major distributor you mentioned across the Asian region? I'm not sure if you're able to, but that's the question.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, one's called Zuellig Pharma, Zuellig, Zuellig Pharma. And the other one is called it's DKSH, capital DKSH. They're both originally, they're both big Swiss private companies, and they've operated in the region for sort of decades, but they do have pan-regional distribution, both full sales and marketing support, but their strength is 3PL. So, warehousing, logistics, and shipping, getting product to the retailers.
Okay, thank you. I think one last question I have. You talked about, doing your homework. I was going to ask about what are the biggest mistakes, but it's obviously the reverse of the tips that you gave us, making those mistakes. But I'm curious if an organization attempts, a launch and it fails or severely underperforms, is it any harder in the Asian markets to recover and become successful than what you'd face in Australia, or not necessarily? You just keep persevering?
Yeah, look, I think it's like a lot of markets. If you enter the market and if you enter the market and you fail, and that, I think that there's a sort of, it can be a very negative brand connotation to that. So I think often if you do enter a market, because a lot of companies and brands do enter too early. They don't do enough research, or they get the wrong partner. They enter, they fail, and then you have to, and it's really hard work to start again. It's not to saying it can't be done. I mean, plenty of brands have done it, but that's why I think you're better to spend more time before you enter the market and make sure you're in bed with the right people, make sure you've got the structure right before you enter that. So then your chances of success are significantly higher. That's not to say that you can't, you still might enter the market. It just mightn't go the way you want, because something might shift or might move. But I think one of the things I really do notice, or have noticed, Brenda, over a long time, both with Austrade, then with Blackmore, and obviously in the subsequent last couple of years, is many companies just don't want to put the time in to do the research. And as I say, if we think about Blackmore's entry to China, and everyone used to say, oh, it's gone so incredibly well, but people didn't know that myself and the other guys have spent, we'd spent literally months and months in China, all over the place, talking to hundreds of different people, meeting with different people before we actually made that decision, and before we put a business plan to the board that they would approve for us to actually instigate a China market entry. And even then, Brenda, an interesting story. We ended China. We entered China in 2012. We had 40 SKUs registered, and within 6 weeks of us entering market, they closed the border to 30 of those SKUs because they changed the regulation. And so, and then luckily after that time, cross-border started, and we obviously did extremely well. But yeah, research, do a lot of research and talk to as many people as you can is really my very strong advice.
Yeah, wonderful. Listen, that takes us to, I think, exactly 4:30, but or 4:32, but I'm going to give you 2 seconds to give us one of your favorite proverbs. I love all your proverbs there, but before you do that, thank you so much for your time. So much packed in there, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and maybe follow up. To the attendees, thank you for participating in the CHP webinar to 6 a.m. and providing Senior Counsel Peter, who's doing some advice work for them for today's session. And I think there'll be a feedback session that David will ask you to give any feedback, and you will get a copy of the recording and the presentation. So thank you all. Peter, your favorite proverb to end the session?
Probably, I've got a lot, Brenda, but I'll just say there's a great proverb which is opportunities multiply as they are seized. So get out there, research the market, but there's plenty of opportunities out there, and they'll multiply the more you do it. So thanks everyone for the attention. It's been really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thanks to all.
Thank you.